Hi, everybody. I'm going to keep this pretty short because this is probably my most documented week. My students were all in attendance, and I was observed by one of my senior colleagues, a thing that we do regularly, in part because I will hopefully be up for a promotion in the not too distant future. And also, it's just useful to have someone come and see how things are going. Didn't expect this to be a day that ended in applause, but that was really nice on what's otherwise been um, a challenging set of days. The class itself was quite good. We ended Jane Austen's Emma, and because now the mystery of Emma, and this is going to have a whole bunch of spoilers for Jane Austen's Emma. So if you haven't read the novel, hey, well, there you go. Here's your spoiler warning. Um, Emma is a little bit of a mystery novel, and as I've argued, and the reason why it's in this class is a game, and it's about the games that are played, and we don't know the full import of those games until all is revealed very near the end of the novel. It's then that we realize that while Emma, we've watched her scheme and play games with different people around her. Uh, it's And we've had kind of the limited perspective of what Emma knows, and Emma is very smart, but she doesn't know everything, and the most important thing she doesn't know is that Frank Churchill has been using her as a smokescreen to hide his secret engagement with Jane Fairfax. And because Emma and Jane aren't friends, he's able to get away with it for until the time is right. And that's the game that Emma didn't know she was in the middle of. And we've talked over the last couple of weeks about the kind of game space in which Emma is operating. It's a small, tight board as these things go. It's not really about power plays so much as it is about wordplay. And we today we read Linda Bree's essay on word games in Austen, and we listened to the Thing About Austen episode, which is a great podcast, about the word games that Frank Churchill uses to communicate with Jane Fairfax under the guise of playing a game of just simple letters. And between the two, between the literal games that are being played, the metaphorical games that are being played, and the game of the novel itself, um, we're thinking through it for a solution that comes, as I said in week one to the students. If you pay attention to Miss Bates' character, who we see in Box Hill at a party, Emma makes fun of her for saying things that don't matter, only to realize, at least I think she realizes, we certainly realize that if Emma had been paying attention to the nonsense, quote unquote, that Miss Bates had been speaking, she wouldn't have been blindsided by Frank Churchill's deception. She would have had everything she needed to figure out what was going on right under her nose. But there you go. So, in the same way that we started the first week of class discussion on Emma by closely reading the first chapter, today we spent most of the time closely reading the final chapter, which is almost directly divided into two. First, we get Harriet out of the way. Harriet, like Jane Fairfax, is a refugee from a different kind of novel, or rather, Emma believes that she's the refugee from a different kind of novel. And my colleague, Dr. Craig Bertolet, reminded me, I can't believe I forgot, that basically this is the plot of Evelina, the Frances Burney novel that we know Austen was familiar with. Evelina is the story of a young woman who goes to London and is officially illegitimate, although she's hiding it very carefully. Or rather, she's been rendered illegitimate by the fact that her father will not acknowledge his marriage to her mother, even though it's all right and tight and legal. And it is ultimately uh, essential to the marriage plot that Evelina's father acknowledges her. They are reconciled. She is made legitimate. She isn't just, legitimate, but she is of high birth and is able to marry the hero. And that's the story that Emma thinks that Harriet is living through. But no, Harriet, as we find out in this final chapter, her dad is a tradesman. He's wealthy enough to keep Harriet in comfort and to take care of her marriage arrangements, and respectable enough to not want to acknowledge her beyond the scope of what he's doing for her at this moment in time. So she's a perfect kind of marriage partner for Robert Martin. Not too high, not too low. Everything is as it should be, or so the phrase goes. And we discussed whether this part of the novel is told from an omniscient third person narration or whether we've slipped into Emma's point of view. And I'm compelled by the argument that some students put forward that many of the structures suggest that this is Emma's point of view, that everything is right as it should be, and that we can question whether indeed this is everything as right as it should be. Because, as another student noted, this is a fascinating parallel to the first chapter of the novel, where Emma is distraught over the loss of her friend and companion, the now Mrs. Weston, the former Miss Taylor. But Emma lets Harriet, her boon companion for this whole novel, slip away with very little fanfare. And indeed, while Harriet will also remain in the neighborhood just like Mrs. Weston, she has now slipped below the social notice of the Knightleys. And if we believe the argument of the narrative voice, be that Emma's headspace or the third person, this is as it should be. That this would naturally ebb and flow. Jane Fairfax is left in perpetual suspense. She is not married off at the end of the novel, but we are told that they are waiting for November. And it's a very tiny paragraph in between Harriet's marriage plot and Emma's. And so we spent this back half of class talking about the paragraphs that see Emma married. This whole chapter only has one line of reported dialogue from someone who wasn't even at either of these weddings. Mrs. Elton tells us it's very shabby indeed. And we kind of went off on some interesting related digressions about fashion history and how we know the nature of the kind of white satin and lace. It's very extra of Mrs. Elton to expect that level of finery. We are pre white weddings in the time of the composition of Emma. But it's not out of the realm of possibility that these things would be involved in a potential wedding. But this is a fast wedding. It is a wedding that is that is, activated by poultry, thefts around the area that allow Mr. Woodhouse, to want the security of having a son-in-law always with him and thus facilitating the marriage of George and Emma. And, not especially romantic, even though these are our focal characters, or are they? One student argued that if we're talking about agency, about somebody whose choices make things happen, that's Frank Churchill. And there's was discussion about Emma's growth, and I think that's where I want to kind of close our remarks, because that's also where we kind of ended our discussion. Very little changes for Emma. She does not have to leave her father's house. Her husband comes to her father's house. Her name will change, but that's pretty par for the course. We see this kind of revelation at Box Hill as she realizes that she has been cruel to Miss Bates, and George Knightley makes that keenly aware. But my students were inclined to argue that that's not a whole lot of incident. And as we talked about reviews from the period, and many people saying there wasn't much story to Emma, although Linda Bree pushes back against this, I found myself thinking about and I talked to the students about all of the different novels of the 18th century that are full of that kind of thing, right? Like Austen famously read another novel that she thought might be in competition with her Sense and Sensibility, Mary Brunton's Self Control. Well, that heroine goes to America and falls over a waterfall in a canoe. That's not Austen's style. But even for Austen novels, Emma's pretty constrained. Pride and Prejudice features the story of one elopement and one near elopement. Mansfield Park is about the trauma of displacement, among other things. Um, People fall severely ill in Persuasion and kind of ill in Sense and Sensibility. Things happen and people move around in all of Austen's other major novels. Not so in Emma. And so, does Emma change and grow? If she does, it's an internal revolution, and one that I argue is necessary for her to become the chatelaine of Donwell Abbey ultimately and Mrs. Knightley. But it is incremental, small growth, not especially flashy. But then, as I said to students, if I think about the ways in which my moral compass or my ethical self or some other part of my internal workings changed in a 9 to 10 month period, which is the span of this novel. It starts with Mrs. Weston getting married, it ends with her giving birth. Um, I don't know that it would be particularly thrilling to watch. Some people definitely do have dramatic and very visible transformations in their ways of life um, and their nature. Moral action spurs them to transformations that can be quite dramatic, but not all of us do. And so I ended with something that Linda Bree's essay reminded me of and made me think about as somebody who comes from the Gulf Coast. Emma, despite all her wealth and privilege, she's handsome and clever and rich, has never seen the sea. She's never seen London, as far as we know. She's never left Highbury, to the best of our knowledge. It's a wide world that she has not seen. And I found myself thinking particularly of the sea, in part because it is sublime. To see the sea is to be confronted with as close to the infinite as we often encounter in the world. It is to be confronted by something far larger than ourselves, something that we cannot possibly control. And what we know at the end of the novel about Emma's future is that for the 2 weeks after her marriage, she and George will go to the sea. So perhaps Emma does not have the kinds of dramatic revelations and revolutions that we expect from heroines of the 18th century and even from some Austen heroines. But I think about Emma at the sea and I think about what lies ahead of her as her world opens up. Even if she returns to Highbury, presumably it will not be forever in terms of Mr. Woodhouse. We discussed a great deal about the nature of his gruel intake and his state of health today. Um, but I like to think that what Austen does by having us think of the sea is to note that this still quite young woman is has experiences that lay ahead of her, things that will introduce her to further places and people beyond her control. And that's not nothing. this has been a pretty subdued recap video in part because this is a difficult time here at Auburn in the world, um, among other things. It's uh, I um, and I I'm recording this not long after um, the announcement of the execution by the state of Marcellus Williams, who was innocent. Um, and so that weighs heavy um, on my mind at this moment. Um, it is difficult to think about the um, uh, the kinds of gentle removes, the spaces that Austen crafts away from the larger worlds of violence that and injustice that Austen absolutely occupied. And I'm grateful to my student who presented today on Sue Lancer's work, which breaks open and reminds us the ways in which we cannot forget the wider world that Austen screens us from, or at least that many readers of Austen believe Austen screens us from. We're never entirely away from it. Um, and I'm also grateful for her citation of Carrie Sinanen's work in that same trope, the ways in which, if we are not careful, Austen becomes uh, a way of um, reifying particular forms of power and injustice if we do not see her with fresh eyes, the kinds of eyes that the work of Black feminist thought and artists and creators can break open for us and help us see afresh and new. Um, and so I will end with a slight digression, if you'll forgive me. Um, I am a British literature faculty member, but as you know, I go rogue. And it seems appropriate to close here with the work of Langston Hughes. I am so tired of waiting, aren't you? For the world to become good and beautiful and kind. Let us take a knife and cut the world in two and see what worms are eating at the rind. The coming week, we will move across the Atlantic, across that sea. Emma will visit towards the Caribbean, first for a playthrough of Dialect, a game about language and how it dies, specifically the slave revolt scenario. And then we will move into, indeed, a poem that is drawn from the language of state violence, um, which is to say, um, the testimony of the Zong massacre um, and the legal case that was connected to that. Um, More on that in the coming weeks. But from the language of that legal case comes Emner Bese Phillips' poem Zong, which is now in its 15th anniversary this year. Um, so that'll be our next reading 2 weeks from now. I am still trying to figure out how to wrangle play reports. I have not yet posted at the time of this recording the report from a single man in possession of good fortune, but I may do that as a twofer with our report on dialect next week. Until then, thank you if you got to the end of this video, and feel free to leave a comment, a question, a curiosity. It's always lovely to hear from folks who are interested. My students are in class and do not need these recaps, and so they are out here um, in the hopes that folks who are thinking about how to weave together these different forms of media might find some kind of inspiration. Have a good one.